Thank you so much for having my team earlier in the session and myself here today to give you a bit of an update on what's going on at the Law Society, the resources and supports, as well as what's up in the shop these days. I wanted to just round out the discussion that you had this morning, but also round out a little bit the discussion that you had last night with the treasurer at the dinner, where he actually chatted with you about the realities of the Law Society's operations and the implications of those operations, and just spend a few moments talking to you about what actually does happen behind the scenes at the Law Society that relate to what the treasurer talked to you about last night, the levy, and also dovetails with the information that Sheena, Priya, and Carrie gave you this morning. So I wanted to start by walking you through a bit of information on our core regulatory activities at the Law Society and the volumes of those interactions in 2018, just to remind ourselves of the type and the level of activity that actually happens across Ontario with regard to the regulation of lawyers and paralegals. With an ever-increasing number of lawyers and paralegals, so we now have over 53,000 lawyers licensed in Ontario and almost 9,000 paralegals licensed in Ontario, the number of interactions that are happening at the Law Society with those groups of licensees and also with members of the public looking for assistance on legal service matters really steadily continues to increase and is really impactful in our key regulatory areas. I wanted to put together for you just a little bit of information on volumes at a glance, and so I've developed a few heat maps, for lack of a better word, to actually set out for you some of the significant workflows that are actually happening at the Law Society, and also any other activities related to public and member volumes, all of which are focused on regulatory support. So none of this actually will depict much of what you heard Priya and Carrie talk about this morning, because those are member service supports and resource supports that we are hopeful you'll all use because it helps you maintain viable practices. I'm going to focus today on what our core regulatory and public interest mandate activities are focused on. So let's just start with our corporate services area. We have three areas of the Law Society that actually focus on regulatory activities. And that involves the entire career spectrum of lawyers and paralegals. We start in our corporate services area, which is the front end area of the Law Society that takes in intake calls and other requests. If you look at this particular heat map, just to highlight a few of the activities that we do on an annual basis, and these are the 2018 statistics. We had over 160,000 calls into our client service center last year from licensees and from members of the public who were looking for assistance with legal issues across the province. We also received over 15,000 different emails, 21,000 pieces of correspondence, all of which needed responses, and 25,000 calls from our licensees who were looking for information or support and help in order to fulfill their obligations, including their status, their fees, their annual reports, the registration of professional corporations, a number of other applications that many of you interact with the Law Society on. They're also the frontline area and the initial point of contact for complainants. And in 2018, we had almost 5,700 complaints against lawyers and paralegals. The next area in the life of a licensee that has a significant interaction tends to be the professional development and competence area, and you met Priya earlier today. In PD&C, some of the 2018 key highlights related again to regulatory activities, and I consider regulatory activities to be cradle to grave, competence to conduct, when you start and you get licensed through to when you retire until as you're moving out. We supported over 51,000 registrants in our CPD programs last year across over 133 different CPD activities. We licensed over 2,400 new lawyers in 2018 just almost 2,400 new lawyers and over 900 new paralegals last year. That means that we have well over 5,000 different licensing candidates, lawyers and paralegals, running through our system at any given day of any given year, because they all have 3 years to complete their activities. We also conducted over 2,000 unique quality assurance activities, and those include spot audits, practice reviews, and practice audits. And those are remedial in nature, and they assess the appropriateness of practices for lawyers and paralegals with a focus on helping those individuals to have viable practices and strong practice management best practices. We also responded to over 23,000 legal research questions at the Great Library in 2018. So PD&C, as Priya said earlier, has a lot of touches with the members and with members of the public. Finally, I wanted to just talk to you about the volumes in our professional regulation core area. I mentioned 5,700 complaints coming through to the complaint services area in corporate services. Of those, 4,200 of those complaints actually were within our jurisdiction and merited being moved to the regulatory review area to find out whether or not we needed to do something about those complaints. We actually had over 1,000 new complaints instructed against lawyers and paralegals in 2018, which means that it was instructed for a full-blown investigation. We had 230 of those investigations actually transferred into our discipline process to determine whether or not we were actually going to put it before the tribunal at a formal hearing. And we had over 130 new applications issued for a formal hearing and a disciplinary matter. We also received, and this is always interesting for people to remember and recall, that we have a trustee services area in the Law Society, and we received and indexed over 23,000 files from clients in 2018 that required support because either a law firm or lawyers or paralegals could no longer practice for whatever reason, whether that was because something happened to them from a health perspective, or we sought a court order to shut it down, their practice down, and we receive and take all of those files and then assist all of the clients to find new lawyers and or support their needs on their files. So we become the guardians of all of that work. And that's a department in the Law Society that doesn't get a lot of information spread about it. It's very critical, and particularly critical in this day and age when we have a very graying bar in front of us, and a lot of us are practicing a lot longer than we used to. Overall, it's been a very busy 2018 for the Law Society, and those three core areas, just regulatory workflows related to those three areas, represent over 450,000 different interactions with members and with the public. And those interactions can range from a few minutes on a telephone call to give someone direction, either within the Law Society or to organizations outside the Law Society, right through to hours and days of activity. For instance, if it's a spot audit or a practice review or an investigation, that's hours and days of upfront work to get the matter constituted, and hours of days and days of back-end work to finalize the matter, to make sure that everything we're doing for the licensee in respect of their career is fair and transparent, and that we're actually supporting the public interest that we're here to serve by ensuring that complainants and members of the public are actually supported. So I wanted to spend a couple of minutes next just talking to you about Law Society's finances. Malcolm had addressed with you the levy last night, and he broke that down into its component parts for you, which I thought was very helpful. A lot of people don't think about the levy in that regard. But I wanted to talk to you about the bigger picture of the Law Society's expenditures and financials today as well, and what all of that means on the ground as we operate. I thought I'd take the time to walk you through finances and talk to you about these core regulatory areas I just mentioned, but also other areas that Malcolm had mentioned last night. In corporate services, in PD&C, and professional regulation, each of those areas are about a quarter of our expenditures on an annual basis. And the other quarter or more supports for our convocation and policy-making activities, including our stakeholder supports, such as the funding that we provide to FOLA, the funding that we provide to the county law library levies, the funding that we provide for other organizations, as well as the activities that we undertake to support members with their mental health and wellness activities, the members' assistance.
The labels on the slide aren't showing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Dan. So I'm not going to be able to fix that now, so let me go around that circle for you. The yellow on the left is the professional regulation area, and it's about $29 million. The burgundy next to its right is the professional development and competence area, also about $29 million. The blue or teal, I guess it looks like a deep blue on the right there, is the corporate services area, and that's about $27 million. Now, what you have to remember, and Malcolm mentioned this last night, is that many of the activities in corporate services, for instance, the intake for complaints, the bylaw administration, activities that you do with your annual report, are actually very closely tied to professional regulations. So the yellow and the blue, which are across from one another, have a very significant impact on your day-to-day regulatory obligations. And then as you move around the circle, some of the smaller areas include the work of convocation and policy development at over $9 million. The services to members in the public is the next purple color, and that's about $7 million. Compensation fund, which I'll chat with you about in a moment, in the gray, the smaller sliver there, is about $3 million. Capital and amortization for the organization is about $4 million, and then the deep brownish burgundy beside the yellow is the county library levy at $8 million. So I'm sorry about that. I can redistribute the slide later, but it looks like your system doesn't want to talk to my system here. So all of these activities together are what make up the total expenditures for the Law Society. This does not include the reserve funding or the general funds that we put aside for those rainy day times when something goes really wrong. And what I mean by that is when a licensee, a lawyer or a paralegal, does something really nefarious and a member of the public is harmed, and we need funding to be able to support their restitution or redress. Those amounts, because they're fund balances and it's special fund balancing under generally accepted accounting principles, are not included in these expenditures. These are core operational expenditures for the Law Society. So that's I just wanted to highlight that to you because, as Malcolm said last night, there's been a lot of chatter out there with the election with regard to expenditures, and one of the big decisions I guess we'll all be making in the next 4 years is deciding what we want to be as a regulator and how much supports we want to provide our licensees as we move forward as well. But I wanted to dive just a little bit deeper now into some of the highlights for 2018 and talk to you about our activities. I wanted to note to you today our complaints area and move through some regulatory outcomes. I mentioned the 4,200 complaints of the 5,700 that are actually within our jurisdiction and that we moved to the regulatory area for a full assessment to determine whether they need to become investigations. Notably here, I wanted to show you that there's been an 11% decrease in the number of complaints for lawyers and paralegals over the last 2 years. This is a great news story. Unfortunately, we have no idea why this is happening. So I wish I could tell you that there was some trend we were seeing or something that was happening here, but we have no idea why this 11% decrease is happening. So the good news story, unfortunately, is buffered by the fact that even though we're seeing a decrease in the number of complaints from members of the public against lawyers and paralegals, what we are seeing is a significantly more complex level of complaints being made against lawyers and paralegals. Many, many more issues being posed on matters against individual lawyers and paralegals with much more complexity in the types of complaints and many more of them. This means that our review of the complaint takes longer and it requires much different and much enhanced expertise, including in areas of e-discovery and technologically enabled litigation activities, digitization, as well as management of evidence as we consider moving these matters forward to investigation, all in far more complex areas. Forensic accounting, actuarial accounting, all of these skills and expertises are now much more in need at the Law Society in order for us to do a fair job of the complaint and the investigation protocol. Other notable facts from 2018, not surprisingly, we are still seeing that lawyers in private practice in their own firms represent the highest incidence of complaints that the Law Society receives at about 80% of our complaints, with 13% of the complaints actually relating to paralegals. And while we still often hear from our colleagues when we go out and speak that young lawyers are not practicing as well as they should be or not as focused as they should be, the reality is that the percentage of complaints against lawyers in their first 5 years of practice is much lower than their pro rata percentage of their professional capacities. So they actually represent 13% of our profession, and they are, or sorry, 20% of our profession, and they receive only 13% of the complaints. That's actually the reverse for those who are in practice for over 35 years, where they're a much smaller percentage of the profession and a much higher percentage of the complaints. So we continue to see a much higher percentage of complaints against some of our more senior members of the bar, and this is something that is also affecting the complexity of our files and our work, because we are all getting older and we are graying, and people are not retiring as earlier. So we are seeing different kinds of complaints coming through in the latter parts of careers. Service-related issues are still the predominant complaint that we receive about lawyers and paralegals, and sole and small firm practitioners still represent a disproportionate percentage of complaints as compared to their representation in the profession. So for lawyers, they're 55% of the profession, but they represent 76% of the complaints that we receive on an annual basis. Finally, investigations. We transfer the more serious complaints to investigations, of course, after we assess their merit. And in 2018, almost 1,100 of those complaints went through to a formal investigation. Of those, we closed about 900, and that seems good, except keep in mind that we received 4,200 complaints at the front end, and we still have years of complaints moving through the process. It does take a fair bit of time. The age of inventory is quite high to actually process complaints and investigations. At the end of the year in 2018, we had 1,215 active complaints under investigation, formal investigation in the Law Society. Our investigations process also does strive to triage all of these matters and to make sure that we're not proceeding with any complaints into an investigation that are less serious or that have no merit, and we work hard to resolve those, including closing them entirely or reaching out to the licensee to make sure that we can work with them to agree to some sort of a remedial option instead of moving forward to an investigation, and help them to make improvements in other ways. The worst cases, however, do proceed to what we call the Proceedings Authorization Committee, which is essentially our gatekeeper for the regulatory activities of the Law Society, and that is the committee that determines the regulatory response based on the importance and criticality of the particular regulatory file. So they may order an invitation to attend, where the licensee has to appear before a panel at the Law Society to have a discussion about where they're falling down, or a regulatory meeting, which is similar, only it will be publicized. It will be a public matter, on up to the issuance of an application for a hearing. And in 2018, as I mentioned earlier, we had about 230 complaints move into investigations and then move through to a full-blown discipline application for hearing. And we held 130 hearings at the tribunal last year for lawyers related to issues that were quite complex and difficult. I wanted to just spend another moment not talking about practice management. There was a slide in here about practice audits, which does not appear to be here either, so we're having some interesting technological activity here. But let me tell you a little bit about what I was going to say and what you should have seen on this slide. Another critical component of our regulatory function focuses on assisting members to actually remediate if they have less than appropriate practice management practices. Our practice audits and our case practice reviews are a holistic review of a lawyer's practice so that we can assist them to fix their deficiencies if we feel that they need to have that support. It is notable still today that when we go out for the practice audits, and Carrie mentioned these earlier, we conduct these on members who are within their first 8 years of practice, because notably we want to get out there and help these people to be viable right at the early part of their careers. 30% of our practice reviews result in a finding that there are deficiencies in a member's practice. The good news is we give that member time, advice, and supports in order to correct those deficiencies, and the majority of those individuals will actually complete changes to their practice and be judged to be just fine once we're completed our audit with them. But there are gaps at the front end, and people do need to be reminded about best practices and minimally appropriate practices as they move forward. The top incidences of practice deficiencies continue to be things like a lack of focus on retainers, lack of proper conflicts, checking systems, deficient books and records. There was a bar chart that was up on this slide that has disappeared on me, and it showed some of these areas. And what I can tell you it showed you in the bar chart is that over the course of the decade or more that we've actually conducted practice reviews for lawyers, the numbers and the percentage of deficiencies have definitely decreased in a trend line down. So the information we're providing on the website, the information that the PD&C committee, division is providing all of you to help you practice, does seem to have a very positive effect on the viability of practices as we move forward. So it is a good news story, but we are still seeing deficiencies. And again, we can't encourage you enough to tell your members in your associations to make sure that they reach out to the Law Society to seek help and assistance, because we will help them to fix those before we have to come out and do an audit, which is ideal. So I wanted to spend a minute right now on the compensation fund and take some time to talk about this very critically important and very unique aspect of legal regulation. The compensation fund is unique to legal professions. No other professional regulatory environments actually have compensation funds other than lawyers. This is a very concrete and very focused public service action that speaks directly to our public interest mandate at the Law Society. The fund is there to receive requests from members of the public who have been harmed by the misconduct or the dishonesty of a lawyer or a paralegal. They've lost money as a result of that. Recently, the claims level for the payments related to lawyer dishonesty was actually increased to a maximum of $500,000. From what used to be $150,000 per claim. So now a member of the public who has been harmed by the dishonesty of a client can potentially claim as much as $500,000 in restitution from this fund. And that means that the reserve fund for the compensation fund has to be increased. And that means the levies for lawyers are increased to support that fund. This reserve money is supported by all of our lawyers in the province, and we received 350 applications for claims in 2018, and we provided over $5 million to clients who had been harmed by the dishonesty of lawyers. The fund, as a result of last year and the year before, which was receiving a lot of very significant claims as a result of the dishonesty of lawyers, was severely depleted, and you will recall having heard this probably from others before. Numerous cases of lawyer dishonesty came forward in the last few years, and as a result, we went below the policy-approved minimum of this particular reserve fund, which is held for the members' interest. We had to increase all lawyers' annual fees in order for the Law Society to be able to reestablish and replenish and maintain that fund at the policy-approved minimums. So in 2018 and this year and again in next year, your levies went up well over $200, almost $300 a year, in order to replenish this fund back to its minimums. Hopefully, and we are seeing a fairly positive trend right now, but you never know what's going to happen. Hopefully 2020 will be the last year of that particular increase to replenish the fund. But never say never, because some of your colleagues do go a little sideways, and we hear about it usually a couple years after the fact. So with any luck at all, by 2021, the levy will drop somewhat because the fund will be replenished and we'll be back to a balanced view. Quick words on a couple of general organizational things for you today, and then I'll see if you have any questions. Law Society planning as we move forward. As you heard last night and as you're all very familiar with, we have a new venture group now with us, and we're going to be engaging in strategic planning right away. In fact, we have been doing strategic planning already with the previous ventures and the ones who have been reelected to make sure that we don't lose the benefit of their expertise within the organization, and we'll be now engaging with our new ventures to help support that strategic activity. We've been undertaking a fairly consultative strategic planning exercise this time around, and we're seeking input from stakeholders across the province. And we've had a variety of focus groups actually related to the Law Society's strategic plan to get some further input. And members of FOLA, Mike included, have been involved in some of those activities, and we really appreciate the opportunity for them to give us input. Strategic planning for the organization is going to be continuing throughout the next 6 to 12 months, and it is becoming more difficult and far more complicated to determine priorities that are the challenges for the Law Society that we're going to face. In our environment right now, of course, you can imagine that determining how best to address significant changes in the manner in which legal services will be provided in the future, and determining what that might mean for the scope of regulatory activities are all very top of mind at the Law Society, and we'll have to wrestle those items to the ground and figure out what our actual priorities and tactics will be to continue to support the public interest and also to continue to support our licensees as they strive to maintain viable practices. One final note is just a reminder to you about current consultations. Please don't forget, and another heads up about those, our access to justice consultation is one that I'd certainly draw your attention to, and we're seeking all and any input to help us to effectively define what the Law Society's scope of activities will be related to access to justice as we move forward, and how those activities might correlate to annual fees. We're also working hard to determine where best to focus, how we want to reduce burdens and ancillary fees for our lawyers, and anything and all input you can give us on deliberations and consultations always help us to get a better framework for that. Few other consultations also on pro bono services and definitions of the finance company, both related to exemptions to the conflicts rules, are also out there. And all of these consultations have due dates at the end of May or the end of June, so I call your attention to those for yourselves and your association members. And that's it for me today. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have or any comments. Morning.
Hello? Thank you. John Kurchenko, Central South Rep. With respect to the compensation fund, I wanted to get a better understanding as far as the process. When the compensation payment is made, is this at the end of the sequence of events that would lead to complaint, disciplines, disbarment, and then payment? Or does it happen at any particular juncture?
What'll happen is we often get the complaints in process. So for instance, we'll have investigations or activities happening right now, and members of the public will be aware of the fact that the lawyer is in the process and will actually start to make those complaints and requests to the fund. It can happen contiguously. Generally speaking, we have to wait to see the result because we don't know what we don't know, and whether or not that lawyer or paralegal has actually been found to have conducted themselves inappropriately or dishonestly. So we will wait till the outcome, but we have lots of files flowing through at any given time that are in process, and we're working with the complainants to calm them down and wait for the outcome before we know.
Once the payment is made, is there also a process, because I didn't see, maybe it's just missing on the slide, does the Law Society then initiate activities or actions against that particular lawyer or paralegal to recoup monies that are being paid out?
We do, and I can tell you, generally speaking, we have very little luck getting any of those monies back. So as an order of the hearing panel, many lawyers and paralegals will be ordered to provide costs. We do collect those costs. It has to be by order. We do try to reach out and find the lawyer and paralegal later to see if we can get the money back in the comp fund, but the reality is very little, if any, money comes back. I can tell you at the baseline in our regulatory compliance area that we were only able to collect about $350,000 in costs in 2018.
And my final supplementary, is there any thought of like changing the nomenclature? Because the reason why I was asking about...
For the client compensation fund?
No, not that.
Okay.
You had mentioned a couple of times the dishonest lawyer.
Yes.
And I would prefer to hear the dishonest former lawyer or the dishonest disbarred lawyer, because it seems to stick to those that are otherwise honest, which is the vast majority.
Right, and I hear you, and some of these lawyers, in the majority of cases, when compensation fund is giving out significant amounts of money, those people are gone. They are no longer practicing, but on occasion there are some individuals have been suspended for a period of time and may actually return. I can take that back. Certainly in all of our policy, and the reason I use the word dishonest is because it's in all of the policies that are related to the actual implementation of the compensation fund itself. It specifically references the actions of a dishonest lawyer or paralegal.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hello. Yes. Ted Mann from the CCLA, Ottawa. We spend a lot of effort responding to Law Society calls for comments with respect to issues the Law Society is considering. And it seems in the end there is an impression left that what we say falls on deaf ears. There appears to be no effort upon the Law Society to actually frame the comments that it has received and provide explanations and reasons as to how that feedback has been taken into account with regard to the final decision that's been made. Our most recent example that I can think of is the whole licensing dialogue that Law Society had. And I know FOLA spent a lot of time, we spent a lot of time in putting together a very reasoned result. And there was nothing in the report that was issued by the committee that dealt with what we had said and argued for. So I guess my comment and my question is, how can the Law Society make us feel as though we're being heard with respect to decisions that the Law Society is making on these issues?
Sure. So I guess let me start by saying I can absolutely assure you that every comment you made was reviewed and read by a multitude of benchers in the room, including Priya and I, who worked closely with the PD&C committee. The reality of the policymaking activity and machine at the Law Society is that we receive hundreds and hundreds of pieces of input from different folks and different groups, and we do take it into account at the committee. The committee activities are in camera, and so their deliberations will not necessarily be reported on. The themes or the thematic information will be reported on, and you're quite right, on occasion, not all of the themes that you may raise as individual groups may make it to the report, but it may be because the committee felt that they either didn't want to take it into consideration because it wasn't impactful at the time, or there was really no way to comment on specific information. We do post the consultation materials publicly whenever we can. We usually ask you for your permission, and I know FOLA's reports are always published as part of the materials that go to all the benchers and are available publicly on our website, so everyone is aware of your input and commentary. I would certainly be happy to take back to the Governing Council that references, more concrete references to some of the input that we've been provided with can be integrated. We are looking at revising our policy reporting activities because we are looking more fully at analytics and trends. And so I'd be happy to take that back.
Thank you.
But I can assure you we do listen. We are very close to FOLA. You are close to our hearts, and we do pay attention to all of the association input that each of your individual associations provide to us.
I don't have a question, Diane. I was just going to say, thank you very much. I think we have to move on. I don't want to cut into Dan's time, so I don't know if you're going to be around for 5 or 10 minutes. If anybody else does have a question for Diana, maybe outside, but I think we have to move along. So thanks so much for coming, and I'll turn it back over to Bridget to introduce Dan.